In a few minutes, Aaron and I will be looking at today's papers with Bundeep Singh Rangar from IndusView. Stay with us for that. But first, a dispute between a drugs charity and the authorities in Pakistan has meant thousands of drug addicts are going without crucial, often life-saving care. The charity says the argument started when the Punjab government asked them for confidential information about all of its clients. Ali Maqbool reports now from Lahore.
In this city, it doesn't take long to find addicts injecting drugs. There are thousands. Until recently, many did get medical attention and advice from charity workers who also handed out clean syringes to reduce the spread of disease. But then Punjab's health secretary suddenly asked the biggest charity to hand over the personal details of all the drug users it worked with.
We amicably wanted to explain that we can't do that, according to the contract and according to the International Code of Ethics. And he stopped our money and he cancelled the contract, and that's it.
In spite of appeals from the World Bank that funded it, the drug charity remains shut, while its staff, including doctors, sent home. Tahir used to be an addict before he says that charity saved his life. He used to steal to pay for the drugs he injected, but now he's an imam, telling others of the dangers of drugs and HIV. But he's furious the government has, as he sees it, unfairly closed the project.
Drug users here knew about HIV because of that project. The workers handed out clean needles. Now the addicts are sharing again. I blame the government for each one that dies.
The health secretary says he was annoyed the addicts' details weren't given to him, but now claims the project was ended because staff weren't being open about how they operated. Well, we've just been to see the health secretary and he says he can't appear on film, but he insisted that this was an issue of transparency. But the charity says the only information he asked for before terminating their contract was the names and addresses of the drug users. The health secretary didn't say why he wanted addicts' details, but said it was the government's right to have them and to stop the charity if it wanted. But all the addicts we found spoke of shocking consequences. When I inject now, this man says, there's a queue of people waiting behind me to use my syringe, and nobody comes to help with our wounds anymore. The government says it will deal with these problems. With the number of drug users here and the potential for the spread of disease, every day is crucial. Ali Maqbool, BBC News, Lahore.
Now it's time for Aaron and I to look at the stories making headlines around the world in our newspaper review today. And as we've been reporting, the Financial Times says the Obama administration wants an independent third party to administer a fund that will pay damages claims to victims of the Gulf oil disaster. The FT reports that BP is due to hold a teleconference in which it's expected to agree to suspend dividends. Instead, the money could be held in the fund until all claims have been met.
And here in The Guardian, it says the forecast by the British government's new fiscal watchdog shows the UK finances are worse than predicted. It says the forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility could give justification for the government to take some tough measures to cut the budget deficit.
As more than 75,000 Uzbek refugees flee ethnic violence in southern Kyrgyzstan, the European edition of the Wall Street Journal says Russia has sent in 300 troops to help to guard its airbase in Kyrgyzstan. The paper says the Kyrgyzstan interim government has asked Russia for help to quell the violence, but Moscow is yet to respond.
And France's Le Figaro reports on the outcome of Belgium's elections. Now, the headline calls it an historical opening for the Flemish freedom fighters. It's the first time that a party advocating the end of Belgium has won the most votes in a federal election.
The South China Morning Post reports the dispute between Honda and its workers in China is worsening. It says tensions are rising after 5 days of halted production. Workers at a Honda plant in the city of Zhongshan are planning a mass rally after talks aimed at ending the dispute resulted in deadlock.
And Jonathan, I really don't want to read this. I don't want to talk anything about World Cup. But anyway, on day four,
it's Australia.
Shush. On day 4 of the World Cup in South Africa, Britain's Independent says England's manager Fabio Capello's gamble on Ledley King has backfired after he was forced to make an early exit from the tournament due to an injury.
You're available for the Australian squad. Maybe they'll call you
maybe
up.
I could do better.
Well, that certainly wouldn't be hard, would it? To discuss all that, Aaron and I, joined by Bundeep Singh Rangar, the chairman of IndusView. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with this story in the Financial Times, Bundeep, and the White House saying they want an outsider to run this BP fund, all the money, billions to be put in a special fund. Presumably that's to make sure that they don't get caught up in lots of legal cases, that they can actually pay out without waiting 20 years for courts to decide. You know?
Absolutely. I guess, when you look at mergers and acquisitions, escrow accounts are used when you really have a high degree of counterparty risk. Will you get the payment that's been promised? Was the money there, and will it go to the allocated parties? If the U.S. government is asking for now an escrow account to pay for compensation and punitive damages, and now they're looking for someone independent to head this, not someone from BP, it shows a lot of lack of confidence and a high degree of counterparty risk.
Do you think, the big question also hanging over BP's head is the dividend, of course, and we're hearing, from the city here that informally it's pretty much done. They're just going to meet, they're meeting today around the board to decide when they suspend and for how long they suspend. But obviously the idea is to use the billions that they would be paying out to shareholders. They'd use that to help fund, of course, the spill and the damage over in the US.
So absolutely. See, I guess dividend is out of the question. It's just politically not going to happen.
Right.
Let's look at the cost of this oil spill. So the fines they could get are about $4,300 for every barrel spilled. So you say about 40,000 barrels a day, which is the upper end of estimates from the U.S. government. Now it's been revised from before. Over 50 days, you're looking about $8.6 billion just in cost there.
Right.
Then you've got about $1.5 billion in terms of cleanup, so that takes to about $10 billion. And then you've got punitive damages. Remember, the U.S. litigation system is very different from here in Europe. It's not just compensatory; it's punitive.
Sure.
So you're looking at about a $20 billion potential funding here, escrowed for cleaning out this mess.
So what are we talking about almost 2 years' profits for BP, is that right?
Oh, absolutely, even more. And I guess it's not just a profit. You've got $75 billion in market cap that's wiped out. That's half of what it was before this explosion there in April. What does this mean? Largely speaking, you've got not only BP now losing out in the U.S. for offshore drilling just a few weeks after Obama was planning to increase offshore drilling, you've also got potentially losing out on other drills and projects across the world, but it also makes it a very interesting target. So you look at competition now setting itself aside and saying, look, we're not the same league, even though our cost of borrowing has gone up thanks to BP. We're not the same, and we're doing safer practices. But BP itself is a big target, not only for competition, but also for China.
Yeah.
And China bought, Sinopec bought ADAX last year for about $8 billion. They need oil resources. And BP is suddenly a very, very tempting target. So the U.S. government has to ask itself, would you rather have BP owned by Western shareholders, U.S. and U.K. pension funds, or by the Chinese government-backed companies?
I'm sure we probably know the answer, but I'm sure they're going to, the BP bosses are preparing for a corporate dress down, if you will, probably the biggest in corporate history. Let's talk about The Guardian. Of course, new forecasts show UK's finances worse than predicted. This is, of course, the government's new fiscal watchdog expecting to say that the growth is not as going to be as optimistic as the Treasury, which there's two parts to this, because that would say, okay, we really need to get these austerity measures in place, these cuts, if you will, but if growth is worse than originally forecast, that makes the cuts even harder, no?
It makes the cuts harder, and also, I guess in some ways you look at it as seeing, is this politically, because the previous government predicted 3.5% growth. Now they're saying it looks like it'll be 2.5%. So how much of that was being constrained by the previous government, and is this the reality now of 2.5% growth? Inflation is running at about 3.5%. So real growth is either at par or negative, which is worse. So the only way you can offset that in the short term is probably by an increase in taxes, which is not going to be healthy for British business, because you're already looking at capital gains tax being increased potentially.
Well, I mean, you could be actually depressing growth, next year and the year after, of course, if you're having to have even tougher austerity measures this year. So that's going to affect this budget's officer's calculations, the Office of Budget Responsibility. They're going to have to keep going back to this regularly, aren't they? Every 6 months, probably.
They're going to have to look at it very, very closely, especially given Britain's exposure to Irish banks and other European. We've got £258 billion in exposure that's not fully calculated yet. And our deficit and debt to GDP is rising. So,
just very briefly, we've only got a few seconds. This South China Morning Post story: more strikes in China, telling us yet again that there are real union difficulties in a lot of Chinese factories. They're talking about Honda this time, but lots of other factories are having trouble, aren't they?
We saw that with Apple just a few weeks ago, right? So it is, I guess, in terms of a coming of age of the Chinese workers, and what has been largely contained so far. far is now getting a lot of Western media attention. You saw that in the past with Nike factories in the Far East. This is not any different, and I think overall it's healthy. It's healthy for getting
Just very briefly, in a few seconds, it's going to push up costs
Sure.
for the Chinese industry, though, isn't it?
Wage inflation is always high, but the Chinese control their currency, so I guess it's got a nice mechanism there to keep that low cost.
Bundeep, thank you very much indeed
Thanks,
for joining us for that review of the papers. And that's just about it from the two of us, from Aaron and from me. Goodbye for now.
See you soon. Bye-bye.